welcome to another Rock My Age podcast. I am really delighted to have with me today Tamsin Calidas, who is the author of this wonderful book, I Am an Island, if you haven't read it. And if there's anything you want to know about resilience, nature, courage, inner strength, isolation, connection with the essence of life and the power of friendship and kinship, read this book. It is unbelievable. It's all in there. But I've read it twice in the last year. It came out in hardback and it's now out on paperback. And I'm really delighted. Tamsin and I had a quick chat before this podcast to check in. But we're going to really just let the book, I think, take us on a journey on this podcast. So it's going to be quite an unusual podcast, I think. I have got some wonderful, I suppose, phrases, sentiments through the book that really spoke to me, and Tamsin has been very generous in sort of allowing me to put those phrases, sentences, ideas, concepts to her as the kind of book unfolds, and we're going to just talk about what they meant to her and how they came up for her in her life. So Tamsin, welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. Thank you, Erika.
Thank you. And you're in your home in your croft on the island?
Yeah, I'm at home here. This is the kitchen. This is really old part of the house. So these stones behind me were prized up from the land in the very early 1800s and probably a bit before as well. This building's been here for quite some time in the barn outside. So it's wonderful for that because you kind of feel that the land's inside and living with you, and those stories kind of inhabit your own life. So yeah, it's great company to have. So small little cottage, and yeah, this is really the heart of the house.
So you the beginning of the book is actually the beginning of the book is actually when you're on the island, but the premise of your story in this is that you were I think in advertising in Notting Hill, and in 2004 decided to being disenchanted with life in London, and also I think you had a terrible car accident. There were a number of things, a kind of perfect storm, that led you to think about moving to this, what you called a remote island in the Scottish Hebrides at the time, probably not quite so remote now as it's home for the last 20 years. And that, you know, in a sense, life changed beyond what you imagined. But a couple of pieces that you wrote in the book at the very beginning was that you dreamed of living a wilder life and lifting your eyes above the skyline, and that you dreamt of staring out at a raw open horizon for years. So something was stirring in you, I imagine, in those early years. And was there sort of a sense of a calling for you to go there?
I think it really built. A great many of us, I think, will empathise with this, particularly after this year, you know, when life is really closed in and we can never anticipate what those experiences and situations that come and find us might be. But sometimes, yeah, you can find life shuttering in around you. And there's this kind of feeling of flex because you're feeling that sort of closing in, and there's a big part of you that's just wanting to stretch. So a great many things factored in for me. I'd been working really hard over quite some number of years, climbing up a career ladder, and suddenly realizing really on my way up, and it was all happening very quickly, that perhaps I was actually going up the wrong tree. And just coincidentally, and maybe not, because I always think there's meaning in this, you know, when we look back, hindsight is such a beautiful thing. But around that time, when I was really exhausted with the long hours that I was doing, I'd worked at the BBC, I'd worked in publishing, and then moved over to advertising, and switched actually from creative work into more of sort of pitch work, which is very, very high pressured and very long hours. And that was also taking me overseas on shoot location work too. So there was all sorts of things going on. And I think very often, you know, above the skyline, I just really wanted to be earthed. So that was one sense of just feeling the earth beneath my feet. And, you know, I think a lot of people will feel that. We're all moving quite so fast sometimes that you just want to take a breath. And that breath came in the form of an incident that really made me stop for some months. So yes, I was in a car crash that took a little while to rehabilitate. And actually that also formed a reset, because it meant that I wasn't able to continue in the work that I was doing. And I had such fantastic support through a whole raft of natural medicine expertise and skill. And that really went very deep. I mean, not just into my body, but also into my heart, really thinking, gosh, this is something utterly different. And I think that I could help others with it. So there was that going on. We then moved up the road. I'd met my to-be husband, and we moved from what had been a very fast, right in the heart of London, quite a fast life, into a much slower current. And the idea was to think of having a family then. And I had some concerns because of the structural damage to me. But I wanted to give it the best shot, both of us. So we moved into this family environment, which was wonderful. And then overnight, everything just changed and became very feral. And unfortunately, we were just on the edge of a gang territory. And it wasn't just us that was feeling this, a great many in the neighbourhood, but our building was targeted. So overnight, it became very feral. We had, these firecrackers and all sorts of things shoved through the letterbox, lit, break-ins. My car was totaled. No, this was just up the road. We'd left now.
Okay.
And that was necessitated as well by the fact that I was retraining. So, kind of needs must. There wasn't quite the same sort of, lifestyle that we had. And I touch on this in the book. So we've moved to here to have a family, and we're close to a reservoir. You can hear all the boats and the metal clinking. And that was really where we gravitated to. And we suddenly realized it's time to get out. And there was one night that was really very frightening that I'd urge readers to the book for. And it was really that jolted us to make that step. And we'd been talking of it for some time. And Scotland made sense. My ex was Scottish, and I have strong Irish Celts and Scot threads in me. I spent a lot of my childhood up in Scotland, so it really felt like being pulled home in some ways to that greater expanse of sky.
And you talk about you say it's an extraordinary moment when you recalibrate and find your compass. And it's during the notion of transit, of passing from one space to another, that your heart opens and your dreaming begins. I love this idea of, this opportunities. We don't often dream, do we? We don't give ourselves the time to dream about what could be. So
I think sometimes don't you find, and also in the creative process, some of our best ideas come when we're not actually thinking and we're drifting. Mm-hmm. And something rather truer and more authentic finds its way through, and it manages to sneak through all of the practicalities. And perhaps it's really that call of the heart. They do say the true north of the compass is that sort of real sort of steady bearing, and I'm a real believer in that. So there was this wonderful map that we had up on our wall. We just picked it up in a junk shop, and it was huge, and it was a narrow hallway, so it kind of filled the space. And every time we passed through in this small passage, you'd almost be brought close to those great big waves and breakers and the fjordic coastline of Norway, which is actually originally where I thought maybe we'd end up eventually. But no, it was Scotland that pulled us somewhere a bit closer to home.
And you talk about the journey for you and Rob when you get into a pub, and I think you've seen an advert for the Croft, and I think you say in your book that you'd sort of said that it was something you and he had agreed on. You'd never live on a sort of remote island. What changed your mind, and what gave you the courage, I guess, to make that move and to decide that? I know you went and saw this place, so do talk about that moment. But I guess the idea of moving from your life as you've just talked about it to that you lived in a caravan for many, many months while the Croft was made habitable. You had no heating, no insulation. It was a very brutal environment to move to. How did you make that shift and the courage to do that?
I think sometimes the we overanalyze change. Very often the hard work with change is almost in the worry and the agonizing before, and before you even have a solution, that's almost the hardest part. And I think there are two ways to look at that. So I think back to my mother's old scales that she had in her kitchen when I was growing up. And there was this very definite sense of weights. And when you're a young child and you're just kind of putting stuff in, things are almost invisibly tipping. And I think that's a kind of good way to think about it. Life can pour its own collateral, a bit like sand or flour sifting. And it can just build up and intensify over time. And so when that moment comes of action, the hard work's been done. It's this forward propulsion, and you just wake up energetically, perhaps one day, and you just know which way to go. It's almost like an energy. I either want to go here or I want to go here. And suddenly that hard decision has been made. And I think that's a good way to make that. We've made the choice to leave after the very frightening incident. And there was kind of no going back after that. It was, I think safety is also a really, it's that feeling of ease in oneself. And once a line is crossed, I think you know them when the time has come to actually enact. And so we'd made this decision to come north, and it was as much to have a break and just to clear the air. And but we came up with a view to look for somewhere, and that process had kind of been going on for a little while. But we actually got in the car and we floored it and we went north, and we got there and it was tipping down with rain. It was kind of just at the cusp of the spring, where it's kind of every season in about 2 or 3 hours. So there we are on Open High Street. We go rushing into to really get out of that downpour, and we just picked up a local paper. And it was so wet and sodden. So we were just kind of drying it out on the table whilst we warmed up with a couple of drams. And it was there. It was this tiny little stamp-sized photograph. And all of the ink had bled because it was so saturated. But I remember smoothing it out. And maybe it was also that thing of actually making that sensory link to it. I'm very, as an artist, I kind of very in touch and in tune with my senses and feelings, and really the language that has as well in helping us to really find solutions and answers, or even openings through which to step, a little bit like open windows. You can keep going past that point, and then suddenly it's almost like the mirrors drop and you realize this is it. And here it is. There's a massive opportunity here presenting itself. And at that point, we each of us looked at that. It was the most extraordinary opportunity, 22 acres, a derelict croft, but one that we could really love and do a lot of the work. And we did have quite some skill set already. We'd done a lot of our own project work, getting the family house ready that we'd hoped to have our kids in. And so I suppose we weren't totally sort of novice at it, but this was kind of, beyond what we'd ever thought. And one of the reasons that we said not on an island was because it was adding that extra level of difficulty, I suppose, being an enclosed community, all of the issues of transport, budgetary situation there as well to actually transport everything over. And yet the fact that here was this place that you knew that if you invested your heart and your love, which is all we wanted to do to create the family home that we needed, we would be able to give ourselves to that, and in so doing shape our home. So we just said, let's go look. And we went over, and the Ferry Crossing, and it was a very bleak, very early March day. The boat nearly didn't run, grey skies, really difficult crossing, and over we go. But as soon as we see that place, it was really, I write this in the book, it was really that fall of silence and stillness, and just really a sense that this for me felt very much like home. And I know that Rab also looked around at that land and thought, there is so much that we can do here to help love it and restore it. Met, a primary objective, which is to bring our life and work much more closely into balance. So here it was, and we made that decision. It was a heart decision, and just let's go for it. There was nothing else to go for, and so it was kind of, well, it's this or back to what we know, and that wasn't an option. So that became our home.
Such a synchronicity piece, wasn't it, to be in the past?
Yes.
And see that and put your hand on it, and just beautiful. You talk about arriving as a stranger was one of the most unerring twists of fate that only held deep resonance in later years, and that belonging requires a community and people, but it also requires acceptance. You had some really tough times in your early months, perhaps years, adjusting, I guess, not for you, but within the community. What was that journey like? Because you just talked about safety earlier. It's a real human, a very human sort of quality, a human need, isn't it, to feel a sense of belonging?
I think it's very common, and I think that's one of the things again that this year has raised. This was 20 years ago. It was a very, very different place then. A lot of the young had gone, and so there was this absence, and those families had kind of been broken up because those people, I suppose, of our age and younger, just wanted to get away. And they had their own finding to do, education, work, love, adventure, whatever it was. And they wanted to get beyond a very small island and also a locality, because the people that I now know very dearly and very much a part of this community, a lot of them have spoken of how difficult it is sometimes growing up in a place and having that same feeling that I had of needing to stretch, and sometimes the prejudices and the paradigm and who you are, that label that can be pinned upon you when you remain in the place of your home all your life. It can be very difficult to shake off. So that's one half of it, and then you've got the other half where you've got others coming in. So on the one hand, I imagine there was a sort of surprise, because why would a young couple such as us choose somewhere when others had left? And there was probably a very deep sense of loss as to, well, what is it that makes that pivot, if you like? We long for our own to be here, and here are others coming in. We did have also very warm, a real depth and warmth of welcome from a great many people, and I write of that in the book as well in chapter 3, Ireland, when we arrive. It was very robust and wholehearted. But in any place, there's an acceptance as well that it's a fact of life. Not everybody wants you there, and various sort of unconscious bias and prejudices that you'll find in any walk of life. So right on the very first page of the book, I think I write that the skies are as fickle and as changeable as all we have left behind. So we were under no illusion that we would have to give of ourselves. I think perhaps one of the difficulties were, we were very quite soft as gentle, I suppose, and that's perhaps a different way of being. We'd not had to fight for any corner or any territory really, aside from having to sort of coexist in this very difficult community that sort of ended up being very feral overnight. That's different to coming into a place that's got sea around it, and you're not just coming to stay either, and that's a big difference. You've actually bought, and so you have invested of yourself, but you've also chosen as your home a piece of land that previously would have belonged to others. And unfortunately for us, we'd unwittingly and unknown to us. And it was just one of those things. It happens very often, particularly up here where sort of land and territory kind of shifts between generations and families and so on. There had been a sort of situation with our particular piece of ground that unfortunately we inherited, and we had no way of knowing that. So that again made itself known over quite some years. And the only way to see through these things is to really keep giving of yourself as much as you can, and to try and reconcile those differences. But yeah, that the sort of situations that showed themselves rather different to those that we were used to. And I remember talking about this with the GP that was on the mainland. We don't have a doctor here on the island. We have to travel to the mainland. And I remember there was one thing that had happened, and I ended up and needed some help at the doctor's surgery. And I said, what is it about this place that makes the skies so large? And, sometimes for it to be quite so abrasive in these interactions, combative, and that's all part of the culture as well. And that was, part of our own growth to be able to meet that on our own terms. But he said, it's like any place. Once you step out of an urban environment, and I suppose where you've got quite so many people all together, the rules have to be more rigid, if you like. And for all the freedoms that you get, the further out to the margins you go, you're also going to find ways and walks and ways of being and of life that are much larger. They're amplified by the landscape and the weather in which you coexist. So, he said that was very, very normal. And his work had taken him through the years, through all of the islands. And he said, in some ways that was accentuated where we were, just because of the nature of the way the demographic had shaped itself. So, I was kind of comforted and heartened by that, because it showed, as well, it was an inkling that we weren't the only ones. And that also became more apparent. And that's a sub-thread that's woven through the book, but isn't, I suppose, overplayed. Our experiences were shared by others. And, a great many letters over this last year, especially to me, for, some of those larger experiences that came later from so many women, especially those living alone, that, said, this was our experience too.
Speaking about that, I know I was in complete awe, Tamsin, of your ability when you were, ended up being single on the island, and you you looked after your flock, you built fires, there was a storm, and you took the roof off the barn. I mean, this was, I felt like there were two things happening. There was as a human being, there was the beingness, which we'll talk about, the wonderful connection with nature, almost a spiritual journey that you have on the island. And then there's also the doingness, the very physical work that you do there. Was that as a real sense for you of both aspects of that? And again, just extraordinary aspect of, I guess you learned a lot on the job doing that.
And we hold, I think there's a lot of territory that we've kind of assimilated almost within our sort of gender roles sometimes. And hopefully, there's a bit of a paradigm shift that's been going on for a little while, I suppose, for, a great many people. And it's actually now coming out into the wider narrative, which is really refreshing. We tend to inhabit certain roles, and almost by perforce, if you like, don't ever necessarily consider doing those things ourselves. And yet, as soon as we do start to do them, again, these are kinesthetic, somatic skills that are within each of us. We are very ancient beings in a modern world, and actually the agrarian society is still rooted so deep in us as organisms. And as soon as we become more attuned to our sensory physicality, and a job needs doing, and particularly with livestock, particularly when there's a welfare issue, you of course give your all, because there's a problem that needs solving, or perhaps a longer term sort of strategic vision as to how to make this work a little bit easier for oneself. And that became more important for me once these hands have been broken. This one was wrongly set and is still wrongly set. So, at some stage it will probably need to be rebroken and correctly set. And, hands are so critical to the work here. I had to learn to sort of work around that, because for some years I didn't have the full use of my hands. I still don't have the full use of my hands because of neural damage and muscular wasting and things like that. But it's amazing how adaptive we are. And when it's a question of, there's no one else to ask, you have to get on and do it. And it's like anybody, when you lose the use of something, it's amazing how your body steps in to help you with developing and attuning and honing those other aspects of you. So I'd say, a lot of times in solitude, particularly, after the loss of my very dear friend, Crystal, and again, I'd urge readers to the book for that. But once that had happened, and I think my grief really caught up with me. There'd been a much longer, sort of harder journey. And that took me sort of, as with anyone, you have to do the work with grief. But sometimes when there's been a bigger process, it's a bit like one wave after another, and you're just trying to keep breathing. And there comes a point that that's all you can do is just focus on just your existence, really. And that was almost a gift with hindsight now, because it opened a much deeper transit into a deeper listening and really seeking comfort in other things that I felt were so much more durable. Friends, I don't know, just the journey in my life, really, those that I've loved, I've lost. And that's a huge sadness in many ways. There was also behind the scenes, a very, very dear friend that also died, that wasn't written into the script. So there was a much larger intensity of experience going on behind the scenes, and I distilled that to grace notes because it was enough. And I'm now sort of quite stunned, when people say, how could you have coped with this? It was only these are grace notes. There was so much else. And there came a point where it was really, well, what can you rely on? And I remember one day I was so exhausted and I lay down, and it was just immensely comforting. And I'd sort of challenge anyone that's needing to be held just to lie down on the earth, because the earth is there for all of us. And it was really this fast track into being a child again, and that close intimacy with all of that nature that's around us. I certainly felt that very much as a child, and suddenly here it was again, but in such a bigger intensity and on such a bigger scale, so that was really the land teaching me to reach for it. And once I started to do that, that's really where the journey started to guide me.
You talk about how strangely full life feels when it's stripped back to its essence, and how little we need, that the land provides for all the basic needs. And it feels like you really attuned yourself into nature, and it almost felt like abundance to me as I was reading it. You foraged, and you I'd love you to talk about your cold water swimming, and it's almost like you used would probably be the wrong word, but you embraced, and it embraced you. It felt like this extraordinary sort of oneness, I suppose you could say, with nature through the book.
Well, I think there was a time of real hard graft and just getting through each day, and it was a real survival at one point, because as anyone will know, after a marriage breaks down, there's quite some extended period of legal lockdown, and nothing can shift. And there was also an illness behind the scenes for both of us, actually. And we were really on our knees, and I inherited a lot of the debt that we'd I suppose built up with the house, always assuming that we'd be able to pay that off with work over some time, and suddenly that some time was now. And so when you've got debt collectors on your door and sheriff summons and things like this, you really prioritize. And for me, that meant, well, if it meant putting aside this amount every week to pay off, and so you haven't got people banging on your door, that then has a knock-on effect with what you're then sort of able to use yourself. And yeah, I mean, it was, I had crops that failed. We had other things that happened that, a really serious power cut over 15 days. So all of that meat that had been culled and butchered and, that was for use, all of that perished, and there was no compensation. And so, you're really, it's not even having to think, you're acting much more instinctively. And
about, you slept at one point you slept in like 3 coats and hats, and you were so cold that you literally were.
Well, I mean, there was no heating. The oil had run out, and there was a winter, and I couldn't afford to heat the house at that point because I was having to pay off the bills. So yeah, you just battle on through, and there was no one to turn to. There was no backup, and so I think, but I had a roof over my head. I was so grateful for that. Many others would have lost their home, and so I think of amazing Raina Wynn, and what a journey she's been through, and I'd love to talk to her actually, and she's given a wonderful review for my book I Am an Island. I think she called it Storm Battered, and this is isolation, what isolation really means. And yet I did manage to retain home, and in a way it was like a wake up, because well, we all live in many ways so comfortably, and all the land is there, and over millennia, that's what the earth has done. It's been there to provide us. And so I suppose it was really sort of awakening to a more conscious existence and place of being, and really using all that the earth is offering quietly and is available for all of us. So yeah, leaves and roots, and I had a bit of background in that, I suppose, briefly from my time in London, but also over the years, foraging is quite a big thing, isn't it? And wild food, and it's nice to do when it's a nice to have, a few jars to fill up. But yeah, there was a time when then that was really how I was existing. And I remember maybe once a week, if I hadn't caught any fish, then if there was I think it was herring that was the cheapest fish that I could buy. I think it was a 50p or a pound, and I knew the fishmonger, and so it was tough for some years. And then you also become more adaptive and more resilient, and that's also one thing I've noticed, having the heating on, actually you pile more layers on, but then what would our ancestors have done? I suppose we're all human, so it's degrees of comfort, isn't it? And you do habitualize much more easily. And I have to say, here in this part of the house, this is uninsulated. There's the range here, and there's an open grate at the other end. There was an open grate that I've since put a firebox in, but even now, with 3 foot thick stone walls, it holds the warmth, and it also holds the chill. So you tend to put layers on and keep moving.
And
different way of being.
you talk about talking about cold. You talk about there was a moment in your journey where you kind of almost feel that everything has got too much, and you head into the sea, into the dark waters, into the shadows, and there's a very very intense and intimate piece around that. And I know that one of the things that really spoke to me about that is you said there's a point where you're forced to make a commitment. It's not a moment of choice, it's a moment of truth. And that the water, and I think the way it was, held you, and then you kind of made a decision, and you carried on.
Well, it was something much bigger than that. It wasn't even a giving up. It was a going to something where you could just be so. It was actually a very spiritual point of just longing to belong with all that is so effortless in the universe. A very, very deep spiritual moment. And I suppose I'd sort of already, attuned to the sea, to the currents, and the deep feeling of peace. And there was just a point where you felt so beautifully held by that universe. It was almost like, I remember a film that I saw a great many years ago. I was really quite young, and The Big Blue. It was kind of one of those moments where you just wanted to be part of all that is. And I was there, and it really felt, the snow was falling, and it felt like this kind of brush of a kiss on my cheek, and the waves and this molten silver sort of light that is always the way in the heart of December. It was actually Christmas Day that this happened, and I'd woken up, and there was I'd felt so alone, and there was no one to call. I remember family, the family remaining wasn't able to be there, and and I think probably this year also has brought that to light, as to kind of, you never expect that moment to happen to you. I'm a very strong individual, with my work also, in a longer frame of natural medicine. I help others in so many ways, and giving is often a very great way of receiving. And yet there came a point where something needed to step in and to hold me, and I needed to be able to hold myself. And for me, that place of real being, really beyond anything, was in the water. It was the most extraordinary thing. And I suppose when you are so open and vulnerable and aware of your humanity and interconnected with all things, a very deep spiritual beat of breath and pulse that's shared by all things, that was kind of where I was. And then there came the moment. It was not a moment of choice. It was really almost like an epiphany. It was a moment of very deep spiritual awakening, I think. And it really felt like the whole universe was beating with love. And it's only the way that we sort of reduce and diminish and compartmentalize our own lives, living in our heads rather than our hearts, when we really have that moment of heart opening and awakening at its deepest level. And that really was a moment where it wasn't a moment of choice, but it was almost like your entire being was called to live. And it we, me, it, us, all of it, this was the moment to really accept that challenge and to accept that offering hand of help. And it was that gave me the breath, and that gave me all of the strength to get back to the shore, and which utterly changed my life forever. And that was really the pilot light that went on inside. It was a very, very deep salt light, blue, quivering flame. It's a bit like in a gas boiler. once that flame ignites and it flickers, it doesn't matter what else is going on around. What it can withstand is really quite extraordinary. And I think there's a real value as well into being quite so honest with that journey and articulating as well what so many of us feel, and silence or shutter away or can't quite face, or perhaps there is a time to have support and help, but that equally wasn't available. I had asked for that, and nothing had been forthcoming, and so you really were working it out yourself. And I'm very grateful for that now, because once you hit rock bottom, it's a wonderful place to be, because you've hit that seabed, and there's it's actually firmer than you think. It's the fear that's quite so unstable, and from there is only one way up. And oh my goodness, your breath will encourage you to take that breath and to keep going. And I think that's where the sea swimming is so wonderfully conducive to stamina, resilience. But when we say these things, we think of them in quite sort of hard ways, and I don't understand it that way. For me, it's all about being heart strong and daring to open that real full capacity of one's heart and being, and to embrace the challenges as you find them, rather than to instinctively draw back from them with fear. And that's really where the swimming comes in, because every day when you stand on the shore and you start to strip, and you've got those waves, and up here quite some weather, in the winter sometimes minus 15 degrees wind chill, and I swim without a wetsuit. You want to be in the water because it's warmer than the outside, and you think those waves are going to hurt when they kind of come and hit you, but actually no, they don't. They're so soft and they wrap, and if you give your breath to it and you're buoyant, and you obviously read your landscape and you've done the work with that, so you're safe. What an experience, because it teaches in such a physical way. Being out of your depth is sometimes the safest place to be, because you are so deeply focused with your breath. And that's where all of our core strength lies, because it's not just from us. That one breath that we share in that single second right now, at this moment, every single sentient being is sharing that inhalation and that exhalation. And I talk about that being the great lungs and heartbeat of the universe, the kind of bigger dimension of that systole and diastole that we are just a fraction of. When you have that to rely on as your support, anything is possible.
There's not a lot, there's, after that piece, it says it all, really, doesn't it? And I feel like that's such a beautiful place to end, because it that universal energy and our connection is really all, isn't it? And I think the other piece that I picked up was the strength that you gained also from the spiritual connections with your friend Crystal, and also it felt like you also had this. I think you talked about it once, an unsaid, that you didn't. It was quiet, silent communication with your dog Maud and your horse Fola, and so that felt like there was also other beings in your life that also gave you this extraordinary support.
Absolutely, yeah. And when you work, I work as well as working on the craft. I do a lot of work with horses, as I know you do as well, and it's that amazing, and all animals, wild birds and so on. When we really attune into that deeper place, it's a little bit like, for fishermen, if you're not into the kind of whole spiritual side, but there's a kind of spiritual element of everything that we do when we do it with consciousness and with our full being and intuition and instinct. And I think it's tapping into that wilder voice. As I said before, we are all ancient beings, and when we start using this as our real sort of core and source, and really our intuitive brain, that's when everything starts to respond as well. And you realize that the distinctions with all these other animals and trees and plants and all of it, but at the end of the day, these are the kind of forms that we names and labels that we give to these things. We're all sentient life. And my experience has been working in different ways with all of these things, you know, putting a hand out and a wild bird will come and rest on it. When you're in that place of connection, everything starts, everything feels that, and it shows itself very, very visibly. And so, you know, some of the pictures, I'll share some of those with you, but also in the book, you know, just moments when wildlife approaches, and what a joyful thing to be able to experience, and also to share with others, and ways to enhance our sort of reciprocity with that, and learning to attune, because it does take time and stillness. And I really think having time in every day when we just, you know, come into our fuller being and accept that we're not here just on our own sort of will and agency. It's a much bigger force that's kind of working around us. I think when we really make ourselves humble to that, and open to it, and seek in a way that's not kind of grasping, but just opening and being still, that's when generally it starts to show itself. And you'll know yourself, Erika, was you've spoken about the wonderful work that, you know, you're involved with horses. You know, you just think something with a horse and you'll get your answer. So, you know, I've been involved with projects before when, you know, perhaps children that are perhaps disaffected or traumatized by various things, and they'll be put into a very series of rings with an animal. Perhaps the angry child is with the angry horse, and as soon as they come in, the horse is away, and there's this kind of waking up of, well, hang on a minute, I didn't even move. But, you know, it's kind of how we project as well. And I think when we start reading ourselves, start reading each other, start reading all that is in existence around us in that way, there's a whole beautiful world that's waiting to find us. And I'd wish that for everyone to experience and discover.
Thank you, Tamsin. Two things to end, I think. You'd mentioned about the photos. There's some really beautiful photos that support the book. And are there more in the paperback, or they're kind of new ones?
Yes. Yeah. So in the hardback, I've got a hardback here, and in the hardback we've got lovely sort of chapter heads. There's one little picture here that I've got of little wild bird. And that's kind of when I'd broken my hand. So we've got chapter headings and act headings for each of those. But in the paperback, really lovely copy. It's got a lot more. It's actually got fresh content in, slightly different content. And also we've got book club questions at the back, but several pages also right at the back of photographs that I've contributed. So we've got some little things of model here and so on. So yeah, really lovely. I loved there was one of you with a mug with a bird on the mug, which I thought was so beautiful. And that's very early in the morning. That was one of the dawn swims. You know, swimming over 5 years at dawn has been an extraordinary thing. And you know, there's a moment just before the sun comes up. You know, first light is really very early at this time of year. But there's a moment well before the birds start calling, and you've got this glow of this ball of fire just waiting to just lift up over that wide horizon. And suddenly it's like the sea awakens. I'm generally in the water at that point with my in-water camera to capture the wildlife, to capture the life that's going on there and the light. But what happens is the sea animates, and it's almost like it flexes its muscle, and there's this great sort of call that lasts for generally about sort of 10 to 20 minutes. And when you're in that, it's really quite extraordinary. And this time of year as well, we're just a couple of months ago, you'll have the moon setting, a great amber ball of fire on the westerly shore, and then the sun rising just at that point as well. And that tracks its way around the skyline. So you can actually read where you are in the year by how the moon and the sun are positioning, and the light fall and snow on the mountains and all of that. Yeah, and quite what the birds are doing as well. So it's a totally different way. You sort of get into a different rhythm and the cycle, which again takes you beyond yourself into something much more expansive. And I think that's infinitely forgiving. It's like, as I say in the book, everything daily breaks down in order to renew. And I think we can all learn a lot from that and give ourselves permission to dare to live as we really truly feel our heart is calling us to. I always think once you're on that track, once you're on that, following that heart's beat of a compass, nothing will stop you.
Tamsin, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. As you know, I loved your book. I loved it more the second time. It was funny, and as you said, there is new content, but I think the poetic nature and the real spiritual journey that you went on and are going on. I think you've been there 20 years now, is it, Tamsin?
Well, touching, yeah. And also some lovely things, if I can just mention. So we've got this wonderful paperback that's coming out, and I would urge people who are doing book clubs, keep an eye on my Instagram page as well at Tamsin Calidas, and also, you're welcome to message me direct through that, but I will be offering book clubs with a seat at my table here on the Croft, streaming live into your homes later on in the year. I thought we'd do that kind of probably towards the autumn when the nights are drawing in. But perhaps, if you've had a first round with reading the paperback, come back to me and maybe we can get together and join me here on the Croft. We'll be streaming those digitally. Alongside the paperback, I've just had a lovely book signing as well from the same publisher, which I'm working on just now. So that will be kind of continuing a deeper journey with nature. And that's, again, with Doubleday. And just last week, I signed with a fine art, beautiful publisher called Hanbury Press, and they'll be binding a book that we're calling A Wilder Voice, and that will be more of a sort of photographic, glossy, fine art print book, and we'll have photographs on one side and then just a smatter of words with the poetry on the other. So that's almost like a wilder trail taking us back to I'm an Island and the world that I've shared there.
Lovely. And Tamsin, you also, I think, obviously with COVID, it's been different, but I think in the future you will possibly do retreats on the island, and you are, I know, involved in other people's retreats potentially, and you have artisans coming in, and you do a lot of the, natural and homeopathic medicine work, and so you have a lot of things that are happening in your life at the moment. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I mean, it's just kind of deepening all these different threads that have been there for quite some years. I won't be offering retreats here just for the next couple of years, just because I'm so involved with another project that's kind of involved with this next book that's coming. But I think once that's out of the way, and it's always a constant process of tidying things up here. I tend to sort of join other people's retreats just now. But yeah, my hope is that there will come a point where we can start to do real sort of, rewilding in nature, which actually starts inside ourselves. Nature is our innate nature. And so it's kind of different ways of reading landscape and taking us out into each of our own environments and learning skills for that. So that's a kind of longer term vision, hopefully in a few years' time.
Brilliant, Tamsin. Thank you so much. I look forward to continuing.
Thanks for having me.
I will certainly join your book clubs. It sounds wonderful. So it's been such a pleasure.
Wonderful. Thanks, Erika. Have a lovely day.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation today, and if you'd like to listen to more conversations with inspiring women, do look at our website, rotmyage.com, or register to have them delivered direct to your inbox. Until next time.